Hello, everyone. For those that don't know me, I'm Adrian, and my research project for this year was titled Culture Building in a Physically Isolated Workplace. So a quick agenda, I'll go over just a project overview, why I chose this project, my research question, my findings to my research, some lessons learned based on the many conversations I had with many leaders, as well as individuals impacted by this new reality, and then some final thoughts given some changes that are happening right now in terms of the economy, just the post-pandemic world that we're moving into, and some new technology that is very relevant, like AI. Quickly, a project overview. I mentioned this last time, but I started my career at Google, fully in person, long commutes. I was not able to work remotely under the pretense of culture building, and it worked. Most of my culture, my network at Google was my colleagues in the Bay Area. Fast forward to this past summer, it was a fully remote internship experience at Microsoft. Did not get to meet a single person. Felt weird. It made me very curious about this new reality. So it made me just, question or tackle the question of what impact is this new world that we live in is having on culture building for individuals, teams, and organizations. So that's what I wanted to tackle and just, speak with as many people as possible when it came to that. Scope was mainly current, as well as future leaders, in terms of who I wanted to address this to, and mainly focus on US-based companies from startups to big tech, as well as informational workers. So some of the findings that I found. So one of the things that I think is important to start with is just talk a little bit about the rise in popularity of flexible work. As many of you know, ever since the pandemic started, about 2/3 of US organizations adopted a work from anywhere approach, 51 of them being hybrid, while 15 being fully remote. And the benefits are pretty clear. For employees, there's the flexibility to work from anywhere, productive work time away from office distraction or long commutes, and then more control over their work environment and schedules, which has led over 70% of employees no longer seeing flexibility as a perk, but as a right. For employers, the benefit includes eliminating the need of a physical office space, reducing the cost of maintaining an office, and then more importantly, for small organizations, access to a wider talent pool. You no longer need to move to San Francisco or New York to get the best talent, which is very important. So it seems like the flexibility is here to stay, but is it working, right? My take is that it isn't working. We're just simply tolerating it. And the reason why it's not necessarily working as effectively as it could is because there's a big disconnect between how employers are seeing this sort of experiment and how employees are seeing it, right? As you can see on that graph, 87% of employees feel that they're very productive versus only 12% of leaders feel that that's the case. And that sort of gap can create any friction in any organization. In addition, many leaders feel that their company culture has been negatively impacted by remote work. But culture can mean a lot of things. So for the sake of simplicity, here I'm defining culture as the shared values, behaviors, and practices at an organization that characterizes an organization. And to be more explicit for this paper is the trust, accountability, and genuine care and interest for one employee or colleagues beyond the function that employee represents, right? So I liked Amit, not because he's a software engineer and I'm gonna get something out of it, but I generally know him, I've had time to spend with him. And yeah, so that sort of, and that just replicated across many different people, that sort of creates the foundation of a culture. And the business theory has been that a strong and positive workplace culture under this definition is a leading indicator of how innovative and effective an organization can be. So that's the reason it matters. Here's a quote from Ursa Meyer about when people are more productive when they're alone, but they're more collaborative and innovative when they work together. She was a big skeptic about the idea of people only working in isolation because of the new reality. So based on the research, here are some of the challenges that flexible work that I was able to find when it comes to flexible work. One, onboarding new employees. New employees tend to struggle to navigate the company's culture and processes without the benefit of an in-person guidance. And many, based on a lot of the conversations that I had with people that started new jobs during the pandemic, felt lost and out of place. And honestly, I myself feel that way this summer, and kind of also conscious of that as I'm going to a fully remote function at Microsoft after I graduate. Internal networking was another challenge that was sort of came as a big factor here, right? It's much harder to meet and interact with people outside of your immediate team, right? So yes, maybe we can all, if we're on a team and we're remote or hybrid, it's easy to just always have weekly calls and connect, but people outside of your team that could provide information is sort of limited, which can create silos and again, neglect learning opportunities for individuals. Maintaining clear and consistent communication was a big finding, right? Different time zones and office locations led to a lack of efficient, productivity among many teams. Many more calendar invites, rescheduling due to these differences, which takes time away from being productive, getting to know people, and sort of building sort of the foundation that many leaders sort of want in an organization. And lastly, just fostering a sense of belonging. It's very difficult to replicate in-person interactions such as team building activities, office celebrations. We all remember the really painful happy hours that we had to do via Zooms. Yeah, they were the worst. So people in general don't feel as connected to their company, which can often make their relationship very transactional, which is never good if you're a business leader. So here are some numbers to highlight the impact that these challenges are having, right? 51% of remote workers believe that their relationships with their immediate and distant colleagues have weakened. 43% feel disconnected and feel that there are more opportunities outside of their companies because of this distance. 55% believe that the best way to develop their skill and grow is to change companies because they're not getting those learning opportunities, which has led about 90% of business leaders to require their employees to return to the office in 2023. Just double click on that, right? Many employers just believe that this is the solution. Here are some numbers. I won't go through all of them, but just to highlight sort of this emphasis that a lot of employers have when it comes to believing that the solution to these challenges is to just have people back in the office, or requiring, or at least limiting how flexible they could be. And here are some of the reasons why they believe that that's the case, right? Improved communication, creativity, productivity, employee oversight, et cetera. So based on conversations that I had with many leaders, I sort of aggregated and summarized some of the solutions to these challenges in three buckets. One, there has to be sort of changes in communication and collaboration strategies from an organization standpoint. The first thing is they need to make a definitive decision. Are we going to be hybrid or are we going to be fully remote? And there are many organizations that just haven't done that from a top level and creates confusion. And I think it's super important for an organization from the top down to sort of do that, but also give teams the flexibility to decide based on business needs and sort of the reality of their teams. Clear guidelines on communication. What are some of the response times and preferred communication channels that they should use in order to sort of maintain sort of the connection between employees in an efficient way. And then I think this was sort of the key that I found very interesting was just a more focused in-person meeting strategy, right? Go for quality over quantity, structure your in-person meetings to maximize engagement and participation. That means that if it's a big product launch that you're gonna have, right? Having people in person versus trying to duplicate that remotely is much better, as well as just all hands, et cetera. Which in the data shows that 84% of employees will return to the office with the promise of being able to socialize with their coworkers. Lastly, improving training and development. Research has shown that the opportunities to learn and grow is one of the number one drivers of a great work culture, and that has been lost because of the coaches that perhaps used to go to the office are no longer available because now you work from home. So it's super important, and this is something I got from a few leaders, right? Being able to create an internal talent marketplace so people feel that they can move internally, especially as employees. Informational workers tend to, get bored year, 2 years into the role. So being able to know that they can do that, provide skill development coaches, and then offer self-taught online courses is super important. Yeah, I think it's important for executives to provide training to managers to know how to manage a team that is fully remote. It's something that is often neglected. And Microsoft launched a management excellence at home program at the beginning of the pandemic that had success in training new managers and knowing how to navigate employees, wealth, sort of health, their communication, their performance, and the team building activities. Lastly, technology. I'm a little bit more hesitant and not as big of a believer, but it came up in a lot of my conversations, right? 10 to 15 years from now, right, VR could enable interactive collaboration and sort of allow people to feel more connected to their employees and companies as we live in this hybrid remote world. The centralized platform is sort of like Microsoft Viva. I think is one that could have a better impact than VR, if I'm being honest, when it comes to being able to manage their employee engagements, learnings, and overall well-being. Here are some lasting questions that I had on my paper that I think the managers should keep in mind as they think about sort of navigating the idea of managing a team that is not going to be in person. Final thoughts here. The bad economy means that less employee leverage to dictate where they will work. I personally, for example, I'm trying to move to Boston, but I'm very hesitant to push the buttons of Microsoft to allow me that transfer because, things could change. And I think it is something that we're seeing. A lot of people just don't feel that they have the power that they used to have at the beginning of the pandemic. VR technology can only go so far. It's very unlikely, in my opinion, that it will have the impact that it will have, mainly because the nature of the product. No one wants to be wearing a device in their head in order to connect in a more intimate way with their with their colleagues. Lastly, I believe that generative AI could enhance team collaboration. Microsoft has been integrating ChatGPT into Teams and other products that could automate some painful tasks that are very common in many meetings, and that could allow people to have more time to connect in a way that, right now when you're meeting with someone, you're likely trying to just get something done, and the pleasantries are no longer there at times. So I think that could help. Thank you.
It strikes me as really interesting. You mentioned in kind of at the end there that the recession kind of shifts the power dynamic and the relationship between employers and employees. That sort of suggests like a lot of potential employees want more flexibility from the workforce, and a lot more companies don't want to give it to those employees. I mean, how do you see this relationship kind of playing out over time? Because it strikes me as like two pieces. Like one is the pandemic showed we could be productive at home, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for many people, yes, they missed the social pieces of the office, but what's the trade-off there? I mean, it seems from when I talk to folks that it's also that they work too much. Like when it comes down to it, a lot of the challenges that come with this topic are that I work too much, and being at home sometimes means I work more than when I'm in the office, but oftentimes allows me at least to create better boundaries between office and my personal life. Like at some point, like is this an issue really about? I guess my question I'm getting to is this an issue about the way we work and the way we manage because of location, or is this an issue of the fact that we've kind of gone from a regular acceptable amount of work done in a week to a really extreme amount of work done by most knowledge workers in a week? Not to lead the witness.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think that the way it's gonna be moving forward is that companies just believe that they're just better in person, especially the big ones that have the flexibility or have the sort of power and leverage to do that. The small ones that do not have an office are going to continue to be flexible and be okay with some of the negatives of having a fully remote workforce. But I think from an employee standpoint, they're going to want that flexibility because no one loves to do the commute. And like I mentioned, no one wants to sort of, some people feel like they're unproductive in the office. But I think it depends. I generally believe that the things go in cycle, and I think when workers were employees had sort of the leverage, and a lot of people, everyone was resigning and going to whatever job. They had the lever to say, like, I want to be here, and if you don't give me that, then I'll leave. And now that's the opposite. So I think we're always going to have that back and forth, especially in sort of an informational industry that we live in, where like I said, all you need is an internet connection and your laptop to do your work. So the idea of you actually needing to be at home, it's not really necessary unless the company believes, for whatever reason that they believe, right, whether it's culture, monitoring your productivity, they're going to do that. But that will go in cycles depending on how the economy is doing. That's my simplistic answer.
It's really interesting because to me, like,
productivity is hard to measure.
It's really hard to measure, but it's also the metrics that we measure when we're in person are arguably much worse than they are when we're remote. Because so it's just a really interesting topic. I'm not sure we have a great handle on this one.
That's why I didn't try to solve it. So I don't think there is an answer. I think I was just trying to put some questions for people to consider, because I don't think there's an answer.
Yeah, great presentation. I had two questions come to mind. The first one was just on the note of like companies that have those return to office policies. I know you talked about like the case for it is more collaboration and innovation that happens when you come in person, but I'm wondering, what's your take on like how heavily the weight goes towards the investment that companies have made in having a physical space? Like how, I imagine that's also an important consideration for making people come back to the office. So just curious to see what your take is on that.
Like they're asking people to come because they already invested in these physical things?
Physical space, the rent and everything. I can't imagine that not being an important factor, but just curious like how that might rank.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. The simple answer is sort of the example that I gave at the beginning, right? Like for a lot of employers that are smaller, right? Like that do not have the money to have sort of an office, remote flexible work is sort of a gift from heaven. But if you're an Apple and you invested, or Google, who invested so much money in, or Amazon, right? Amazon's spent a lot of money in a lot of their HQ. It makes sense for them to be like, all right, we already spent all these capex on this. I think we can obviously, flavor it with, oh, we want better productivity and culture. But yeah, I'm sure it plays a huge factor. What percentage of it? I'm not sure. I'm sure not small though. Yeah.
Anecdotally, I was talking with an employee at Car Gurus in Boston. They just completed a brand new office building on Mass Ave. And coincidentally, at the same time, they made everyone come back to the office.
And surprise.
So I think it's directly tied to significant investments in real estate and the worries about what will happen if we cause the commercial real estate market to implode, which would have significant consequences for the economy too.
Which is a big problem.
I think that's why.
Yeah.
It's more our company has started, but.
Yeah.
That's a good example. And then just the second question I
Yeah.
had is you talked about like for hybrid work for companies thinking about how do you make in-person meetings more meaningful?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, I know I've seen some examples of companies that maybe they're fully remote, but they come back once a quarter for like in-person retreats. I've seen other examples like that. I'm just curious from your conversation and from the research you did, like are there any like best practices that come to mind for like the best use cases for like how you can make those in-person meetings meaningful, like when you should have those, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I spoke with Teresa Burlington, maybe pronounce her last name, and she mentioned she was part of that. She was part of Medium, and she was sort of in charge of leading that decision to go fully remote, and then also to deciding like when to actually bring people in. And she said that I think the most important thing is to the event or the meeting has to be very important, right? It has to be important and it has to be well structured where people are getting to interact with other people, whether that is a big project, whether that is, and all hands where we're going to talk about a big change that the organization is going to go through, or some new investment acquisition, something that is going to be drastic for the company, and that doesn't happen often. You perhaps want to sort of sell it as like, this is a great opportunity for us to meet together. It becomes difficult once people start like moving to different states, because then are you gonna, financially support them to stay at a hotel, right? Like it gets tricky, and it depends on how big or small of an organization you are. But yeah, like team building activities that perhaps involve bringing a coach that is gonna, do something for a product team that is relatively new, or perhaps the company is making a pivot into a new sort of area, so we're bringing someone. So instead of having a Zoom call where everyone can see this person, why don't we just create an event? Yeah, and then all hands, which only happen quarterly, right? Like those are always a good excuse. But then I think the most important thing is like giving the flexibility, because those are like company-wide meetings, and those can be very difficult. But then giving like team like team leaders, managers, the agency and flexibility to make those decisions, and allow them to decide how often they want to do that.
How do you think about different tasks? So if I'm a computer programmer, my tasks are very different than someone who might be in marketing and communications or something like that. And so you talked about this as a general phenomenon. How do you think about the specific tasks of the work that's involved?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think had I done it by function, we would have been here forever. Sales organizations, they've been doing this for quite some time. So this idea of working remotely, not needing to go to the office, living anywhere has always been the case. So when you talk to that specific function, it's like relatively easy. I think and sometimes sales people tend to work in silos. So like the isolation doesn't really hurt them. It actually benefits them. Less distraction, more time to work in that sale. Product teams, engineering teams, right? When it involves a product manager, an engineer, like that is when you start seeing people sort of suffer, because the creativeness of having a whiteboard and like, let's talk and let's erase and go through that. Yes, you can replicate similar digital tools for that, but it's just not the same. So that's where a lot of organizations, that's another argument that a lot of organizations are making, these big tech companies are making, right? From a product standpoint, we want to bring our teams together, especially when it comes to that brainstorm and creative aspect, right? Because if you're sales and all you're doing is closing deals and you have the product, yeah, you don't need to be in the office, right? You can take the call from Zoom. But if you're in charge of something creative that involves other people, that's when it makes sense. So those two functions were the ones, and then you have HR and marketing. They all fall more or less in between the two. But I would say those two are sort of the extreme, sales and product, and then those in between tend to, it depends on the organization. Thank you.